Greetings, programs. Welcome back to ArcNeo Reviews, where I'm gonna do something that I've wanted to do for a little while, where I'm actually gonna go through and, to the best of my ability, explain a lot of the sort of Transformers-specific, unique terms that you're gonna come across. Because, I've been collecting properly now for, I'd say, about 3-4 years. And, even to someone who wasn't new to Transformers when I started properly collecting, as soon as I got in that circle, there was culture shock. So many terms that I did not understand what they meant. So, kind of as my way of giving back to the community as a whole, I'm going to go through and, again, best I can, explain these terms. Now, there's going to be a few terms that they're rock solid definitions. This is what this means, no ifs, ands, or buts. But there are a few other terms that they aren't quite as solidly defined. There's maybe a little bit of discourse on their exact meanings. For those, I'm going to put a nice big asterisk right up here, and you're going to hear that sound. So, if you hear that sound right after I say the word and see the asterisk appears, that means you're getting more my understanding, my take on it, as well as how I will use that term in my own work. So, if you've heard me use these and you're like, what does that mean? Here's what it means. So, and also this will be a little bit of a show and tell, because for everything I'm mentioning, I have done my best to provide examples. So to start this off, I'm actually going to cover what seems to be the most widely used term that also has the most confusion around it, and that is GPS, or Gold Plastic Syndrome. Now, the first thing to know is that gold color does not equal GPS. Now, what this is it's a particular, basically plastic. It's a certain polymer that Hasbro used for a time that it doesn't want to exist. That's the best way I can explain it. It doesn't want to exist. Now, Cybertron Repugnus here is the only figure I own that suffers from it. Thankfully, he's a very mild sufferer, but this sort of goldish copper plastic on him, it's not that it's just fragile, it's that there will at some point come a day where I will go pull this guy out of, my drawer or something, or even just off of a shelf, and there will be parts of this just laying beside him. It's not like clear plastic, which I know a lot of people complain about being fragile. This stuff genuinely will crumble to dust without any interaction whatsoever. Meanwhile, little Goldbug here, he's perfectly safe. This guy, for being gold, does not have gold plastic syndrome. And that's a bit of an important thing to differentiate here. It's not all gold plastic that has GPS. And not all GPS plastic is actually gold. The main way you're going to tell is you see this kind of pearlescent, little bit of swirl going on in the plastic. And yes, it's actually used up here in his head and a spot in there in his thigh. He's got this in a few places. But it's sort of that pearlescent swirl plastic. That stuff it's going to die at some point, no matter what I do. It's a bit of a bummer because I got this guy very early into collecting, and it's a bummer to know that one of the first figures I got coming into this is literally going to just one day go poof, like, Thanos snap. So that's a thing there's a reason I'm putting this first on the list. It is the most important thing to know. So whenever you're buying a figure and someone says, warning, GPS, that means that figure is going to disintegrate. someday, somehow, no matter what you do. So keep that in mind. And yeah. So for the next term we're going to be going over, we're actually doing a little bit of a threefer, and we are going over repaint, remold, and retool. Now, this is something that you will run into with other things. This isn't specifically Transformers related, but it's widely used in Transformers, to say the least. So, to kind of cover the best I understand with this, again, you heard the sound and you saw the asterisk. Asterisk is still there, even. So, to explain this one, I've got the 3 latest Soundwave figures, kind of go over at least the best I can tell in differences. And the first thing to know is I don't have a repaint here. I'll show a repaint here in a second. But as for a remold, that would be more like Sound Blaster here. The engineering, the transformation, everything about him is exactly the same, but in this case, there's literally one part that's different, that being this slightly thicker chest cavity, so that he can hold 2 cassettes instead of 1. But the point still kind of stands that other than this piece being a little bit different in some way, everything about the figures is identical. Completely identical. Same accessories, same everything. Different color, slightly different pieces. Meanwhile, over here, we have the Earthrise Soundwave. Forgot his name for a second there. But Earthrise Soundwave is much more of a retooling, in that he doesn't just have new, different parts on him, but those different parts have actually altered the way he transforms. You know, he's got joint sections and pieces here that completely do not exist on these two. These two turn into some weird, like, space freight barge. This guy turns into a cassette recorder, like the old, original. So, again, the best I can explain, that's the difference between a remold and a retool. But then we get into the land of the repaint. And the repaints are the most obvious. This is clearly the exact same figure. Everything about this is the same. They're just painted differently. Starscream and the Seekers obviously are the most notable of, that type of thing. Here we actually have 2 of the 4 Siege Dotson brothers, as they're referred to, with Barricade here now becoming a retroactive member of the crew. So, yeah, here's more or less what a repaint is. As well as sometimes with repaints, you will get, a difference in head. The head will likely change, and that still counts as a repaint because nothing else has changed. So there's kind of your differentiation of the 3 terms. So for our next term we're going to go over, we're covering the dreaded Shellformer. This is one of the most negative terms you will ever see used in Transformers collecting. And thankfully, the Earthrise line just gave us, like, the greatest example of that ever with their new RC mold. This one not being RC, I think her name's Lifeline or something. I wanted the Ratchet, and Ratchet came with her. But to very easily sum up what a Shellformer is, the figure has nothing to do with the alt mode. Because here you can see, fully formed, complete robot mode, and hanging off of her back, her entire alt mode. This figure makes it so easy to explain. Not all of them are this blatant and this terrible, but yeah, basically a Shellformer is, there's no real integration of the 2 modes between each other. There's just simply, you've got a usually a car, funny enough, a car or a truck, but you've got a car or a truck just stretched out over and attached to the back of a robot. So you'll fold the robot up and stick them under the shell, and then when they transform, you just pull the robot out, straighten them out, and then fold this up into a big backpack that's really dumb looking. Yeah, spoiler alert. When I do review this mold, it's not getting a favorable review in any way, shape, or form. But yeah, there's shell forming. And moving on, our next term is going to be parts forming. Now, parts forming is something kind of interesting in that it has two different ways that it works. The first way, the best way I can explain it is to bring Siege Megatron into the fold here, because this is weapon parts forming, where, simply put, this notwithstanding, that since this is from another figure, technically, but part of this alt mode, it's almost always part of the alt mode, is actually the weapon for the figure. So to transform it, you take this piece, this part, as it were, pull it away, and it goes off, does something completely different than the rest of this. So that's the first form of parts forming, where it's just the weapon connects to the alt mode and becomes, helps form the actual alt mode. But then the other one, and go say really quick, most people are fine with weapon parts forming. It's kind of seen as just a cool integration, and usually it will result in connections that make it easier to keep your weapons. But meanwhile, there's the other form of parts forming, which the best figure I could show for explaining this is Brunt here. Brunt's whole gimmick is that he's a parts former, that you can take him apart and make him into other things. So for Brunt, it isn't a problem, because that's literally the point of the figure. But, and I'll throw a link up here to my G1 Starscream review to show as a better example. The bad parts forming is where you literally, in order to transform the figure, have to take off certain parts and then put them back in different places to make the other modes. This would have worked better if there was... Oh, there we go. Ah, yay. So, yeah, here clearly I've just mangled poor little Brunt. But that's... G1 Starscream is known for being one of the worst, but a lot of G1 figures did this. It's pretty rare nowadays, but we do still run into it. When you hear about a parts former, it means that instead of just doing, a smooth, transition where you're just taking a joint and folding it here, you're actually going to have to take it apart and put it back together to get to the next mode. So that's parts forming. So for the next term, funny enough, this is a term that I believe was coined by MGO. I could be wrong, but that is VHS, otherwise known as Visible Head Syndrome. This one is really straightforward. It is, I can take the figure, turn it upside down, and there's the head. The head is not hidden. It's just right there. Anyone who crawls under the car or sees the plane fly overhead sees the head. It's pretty simple, straightforward. It's not really a deal breaker. It's just more of a funny thing to point out. And it does sometimes happen in weirder ways. Like with Hot Rod here, you can see his face in his windshield. This is also the reason that a lot of people are saying Hasbro should stop using clear windshields. Because for a time they didn't. This would have just been painted blue instead of it being clear blue. Some people want that back because, yeah, that happens sometimes. And I think it's funny. And according to certain pieces of media, it's accurate. But Some people really dislike it, so there you go, visible head syndrome. And for the next term, this is one that I know I've used in at least one video, possibly more, but that is Genericon. And simply put, Genericon is a term very widely used in reference to movie figures. It's a generic Decepticon. So, yeah, we had very few Decepticon figure or characters in the movies. Usually you got like 4 or 5. That doesn't make for a good toy line. So, for the toy lines, it's really funny the way they did this, because a lot of the extra Autobots that we didn't see on screen, we still were getting known characters. You know, we had a figure for RC and several others in the first movie line, even though these characters didn't show up until the second movie or the third movie. Meanwhile, for the Decepticons, they gave us random names like Crankcase or Demolisher, and things that are either just widely used generic non-character names, or some being names of characters who would show up later, but they had nothing to do with the actual character. It's a little complicated in that respect, but short version is it's Hasbro fleshing out the toy line by making random Decepticons. It did always seem to be Decepticons they did that with. So that's kind of where the term goes. So because this video is going on, we'll go ahead and have sort of a mini review, but we're going to cover the topic of worst Transformer ever. Now, what's funny about this is when you're talking about the best Transformers, it's a very wide debate. There are a lot of people who will argue a lot of different figures from all throughout the whole existence of the brand. You know, it's a big thing. But when you flip that around and you start talking about the worst Transformers, one figure actually really, really stands out from the rest. That being Universe Ironhide. So, consider this my 10-second review on Universe Ironhide. This thing is a disaster. Its van mode looks like it has been in a horrible accident and it is crunched to bits. The robot mode is a pain in the butt to transform into. So bad, actually, that if you can see up there, the previous owner literally cut part of the figure off just to make it a little bit easier. And the robot mode looks terrible because he's permanently hunched over with his head halfway down in his chest. And so, yeah. Worst Transformer ever. Whenever that debate comes up, just say Universe Ironhide. 90% of the internet will agree with you. So moving on, now we're going to cover two terms that are sort of connected, so it made sense to do them together. But we're going to look at Kibble and Faux Parts. And one of the best ways to cover Kibble is to bring in yet another Shellformer, this being the Studio Series Bumblebee movie Cliffjumper. Simply put, Kibble is a part of the figure that's just giving away what the other mode. So in terms of Cliffjumper here, you see these big pieces of obvious car that are just kind of hanging off, not actually contributing to the robot mode. Those are Kibble. Another good example is this Starscream that I looked at a few days ago. That figure, while it's in jet mode, you can just clearly see from all angles his arms just bent, tucked up under the wings badly, and hanging out of the sides. So, more or less, Kibble is, it's not just that, a visible part of the other mode is there. It's that it's a useless part of the other mode. Another example of, well, I guess sort of an example of some good Kibble, as it were, the not bad kind, we're going to look at Runabout here, where, yes, he's got just his wheels here on his feet, but it's still part of the car mode. You know, yes, clearly this is just the front of the car, but it's also his feet. It's not a part of the car hanging off doing nothing. And he's also our example for faux parts. You'll hear a lot of people talk about faux parts, usually in relation to a faux chest, as it were. And that is, it's pretty simple, but you might not know exactly when you first hear it. As you can tell, the chest here is meant to look like the top of the car. Well, the actual top of the car mode is here on his back, hiding under yet another piece of Kibble, this backpack chunk that contributes nothing to the car mode, the robot mode, I mean. It's just here to help form the car mode. Whereas, like, these doors, I would not call this Kibble, because this isn't just random doors, it's his arm. So, the Kibble one, I'm sure I'm going to get some flack on, because I'm sure I'm not defining it the way a lot of people do. But more or less, that's Kibble and faux parts in a nutshell. So, for the next term, we're going to cover a very common term, and that is the H-tank. Now, I'm sure that this is not a term solely unique to Transformers, but it's a term you will hear a lot in Transformers, and Armada Megatron here happens to be basically the progenitor of that term. And I hear a lot of people rather confused about what's an H-tank. What is an H-tank? The letter H in the shape of a tank. It really is that simple. So, and not all of them are this obvious, but like the Generations version of Warpath here, this is also considered an H-tank. It's kind of a weird wide H on its side, but still, this is an H-tank. Quake here, one of my favorite figures of all time. This is an H-tank. And for anyone going, so what makes it not an H-tank? This is not an H-tank. This is just a straight rectangle. Yeah, there's a little dip in here, but for the most part, it's just pure rectangle, one piece of tread going all the way down, not two treads, two separate distinct treads. That's roughly speaking, again, some of these are kind of rough, but that's what separates an H-tank from just a tank. So, moving on, the next term is chug. You will hear chug used all the time in referring to figures. Now, what this means is it's an acronym for Classics, Henkei, Universe, Generations. And really kind of what that's describing, actually, it's not as complicated as it sounds. It basically just means modern mainline Transformers. So I've got a couple just random figures here. This is a Henkei Megatron. That's a Generations Warpath, making his second appearance in this video. We've got, what else have I got here? Titans Return Slug Slinger. All of these, and clearly plenty more that I don't have. I think this guy might actually be Universe, so I'll put him here as well. I can't remember off the top of my head. Basically, all this is referring to is the all-encompassing modern-day mainline Transformers. You know, it's not one of the kid-focused spin-off lines like Rescue Bots or Cyberverse or any of those. It's not a live action movie line, which usually are just named after the live action movies. And it's not classic vintage figures from Generation 1, Generation 2, the Beast era, the Unicron trilogy. It's not anything old enough to be considered vintage. It's just the main line, for lack of a better term, right now at least, normal Transformers. So yes, it does cover a big, big swath of time. But the thing is, you can grab figures of different characters from all over these different generations, or these different lines, I should say. And other than the engineering just over time getting better in general, they will basically go together. They'll still have mostly a cohesive design and style. Their scale will be around the same size. There's always going to be some variability and things like that. But for the most part, they're going to gel together. So that is Chug. Now, next up, we're actually going to be covering one of the most... It's probably the newest term on this list, as well as the most controversial. And that is going to be Mini Masterpiece. Now, to get this out of the way, for people who don't know, Masterpiece figures are incredibly high-grade collector item, collector grade Transformers. They've got die-cast metal, they've got really, really involved, intricate transformations. They're huge. They cost like $100 at bare minimum. They're kind of the top echelon of Transformers. And recently, we've been getting this term of mini masterpiece. This is A, a term that not everyone fully agrees on, and B, a term that makes some people incredibly, incredibly angry, actually. But to keep it sort of simple here, I brought in two Earthrise boys that I hear that term applied to, and to kind of explain the few times anyone will ever hear me say mini masterpiece, it simply has to do with the way that Earthrise Optimus and Netflix Soundwave transform. It is actually very similar engineering to how the Masterpiece figures transform. I do have Masterpiece Soundwave. I have MP10 Masterpiece Optimus Prime. Weird emphasis on the word there, I know. But yeah, having those figures and putting these ones beside them, there are a ton, absolute ton of similarities. Especially after I went and picked up the 3D printed shoulder or arm fillers here for Soundwave. Now, this is a term I will say, use with caution. There's a reason I don't really use it at all myself, except with certain people who already know my definition at least. Because a lot of people feel, I don't know, I guess that the term sort of devalues the actual Masterpiece figures, or it kind of cheapens them in a way, because at the end of the day, Masterpiece figures still absolutely blow these things out of the water. Like, this is a $50 figure because of its trailer, this is a $30 figure, and there's a lot of similarities to the Masterpiece, but there's still a huge, huge change in quality, the paint applications, all that sort of stuff. So this is not a term that people like, and I don't even know if it will stick around. This video might become very, very dated in the future. But as for right now, when you hear mini masterpiece, it's talking usually about a supremely similar engineering language to the masterpiece figures in terms of how they transform. Though there is another way in which that term is being used a lot. This is the way that I do not use it, never will use it, but it's being applied to figures like Kingdom Cyclonus. And that's simply referring to how really, really good his transformation is. A lot of people think that his engineering is on par with the masterpiece figures. I'm not going to speak on that because I only own 4 masterpiece figures, and that's not enough sample size. I don't plan on getting more masterpiece figures either. They're fragile, relatively, and just so far beyond my budget and space limits. But yeah, a lot of people are using it in terms of figures like Cyclonus, a lot of these newer Studio Series figures. That's a way that I'm not going to use it because I do understand, at the end of the day, if Takara releases a proper masterpiece Cyclonus figure, assuming they haven't already and I'm just too stupid to know because I don't actually follow masterpieces, it's going to be so far above this guy. So even if it ends up having... Now, if that figure has a similar transformation, then I will call this guy a mini masterpiece. Because now he's similar to that figure in terms of its engineering. But for me to call this guy without a masterpiece figure to compare him to a mini masterpiece, this, knee down would have to be die cast. I would need a lot more paint apps, maybe like some panel lining going on here. How about, instead of just really good light piping, give me a button, that just makes them light up. There would have to be a lot more for a figure on its own to qualify as mini masterpiece for me. But these two, from time to time, you will hear me call them that, in that they are similar to the masterpiece figures. So, again, this is the controversial one. Use this term at your own risk, but more or less, this is what it means. And again, the problem with this term is it's kind of a new term. It's changing bits here and there. So, we'll see if it sticks around at all. We'll see if it gets a solid definition. Who knows? This video might get very, very dated at this point. And for the last thing on this list, we're going to cover one of the hardest to understand terms, or rather, collections of terms, and that is the size classes. Funny enough, my dad in particular asked me to put this one on the list, because while he owns all of 3 figures that I gave him, he watches my videos and he's like, okay, I hear you talking about these different sizes. What do those mean? And here's the problem. They don't mean much. Because ultimately what it comes down to is the different size classes have nothing to do with size. They used to, as I understand, back in the day, it was based on parts count, amount of plastic, certain degrees of engineering. Basically all leader class figures, for instance, would also always have a battery, light and sound gimmick. There was all kinds of things like that. Especially here in the modern era, all that these different terms mean, and I'm talking about Scout, Legends, Basic, Deluxe, Warrior, Voyager, Ultra, Supreme, Leader, Commander, other Cyberverse Commander, because there's 2 different commanders that are on polar opposite scales. Titan. More or less, all it really comes down to is the price point. Because a Voyager figure is $30. A Deluxe figure is $20. A core figure is $10. Because right here, if you look at these two figures, these are both from the Studio Series line. And they're roughly the same size. When I transform them, they're roughly the same size as well. So, yeah, what's the difference here? This is a $20 deluxe figure, and this is a $30 Voyager figure. Now, to be fair, yes, this one probably is $30 because he's got a little bit higher parts count, he's a little more involved to transform, as well as he comes with a lot more accessories. Like, this guy comes with a lot of stuff. We'll cover that when I give him his video. But as it stands, yes, this is a figure that will cost you $10 more than this figure because reasons. I know this is probably kind of a bummer note to end on here, but that really is what it comes down to with these different classes. It's basically just saying what price point they're in. Now, if I'm looking at older figures, it takes on a little bit more meaning. Because if I'm looking at... funny enough, generally speaking, it also has to do with that whole chug thing. Because pre-chug figures, it was much more a defined size class. Whereas in chug, it became much more price point. So there is sort of that. But when I'm looking at these pre-chug, Cybertron and Robots in Disguise figures, when I'm saying, this is a leader class, you can assume there are lights and sounds. When I say this is a Voyager, that means there's no lights and sounds, but there's better engineering. Funny enough, there were a lot of figures in the Unicron trilogy that were released simultaneously as Voyager and Leader figures. The only difference was the Voyager figure was smaller and it didn't have the lights and sounds. So, this is a very hard term to deal with. It really, or set of terms, I guess, it really depends on the exact line that you're looking at. But more or less, it's just... I'm basically telling you what the figure costs at this point. If I'm looking at a Voyager figure, that means it costs $30 if you want to go get one brand new at the store. And that's kind of it, I wish I had more to say that wasn't just me sitting here rambling like an idiot. So, that's where I'm going to end this for now. I'm sure at some point I will come up with another huge list of things to cover and explain. But for now, I'm going to go ahead, end this here. Hopefully this has been useful. Maybe send this one to people that are new into Transformers and are still figuring these things out. This will at least get them, or you, if you're the person who was sent this video, this will get a head start at least. This is not comprehensive by any means. There's plenty of other things that are going to come up. But for now, I'm going to go ahead, end this here. Thank you guys for watching, and as always, I will see you next time.